Well, greetings, everyone. Welcome back to the Shakedown. I'm your host, Aaron Dawson, joined by Mr. Sean Stewart as we wrap up this series on surviving the mental chess game. Thus far, we're talking about contraband, talking about favors, talking about taking it personal. Most of the conversation, if you will, has been geared at or aimed at the line officer. Obviously, that was on purpose, but when we talk about surviving the mental chess game, there's some things that need to happen prior to that officer entering that housing unit, the one standing there confronting those inmates. There's a responsibility, if you will, that doesn't necessarily fall on that line officer that needs to be taken care of before all that, and that's on the leadership. Whether that be frontline supervisors, mid-level supervisors, administration, whatever level that is. There are some things that we need to do to prepare our staff for what they're going to face, and depending on where you fit in the chain of command, if you will. If this speaks directly to you, awesome. You may say, "Well, hold on, I'm just a line officer. I'm not a supervisor." Well, you may be. You sticking around in this career field long enough, odds are you will be. And so, if nothing else, file it away and make use of this information when it's your time. But Sean, what are some things I know in your experience? What are some things that you think about as an administrator, as a captain? What were some things that you needed to do for your officers ahead of time to prepare them?
Well, obviously, the first obvious thing to do is have quality policies in place that protect the officer, right?
Yeah.
Because a lot of officers are going to refer to policy, and I'm not going to sit here and say today you can have every scenario that some officer may face in policies and procedures,
right.
or your policy book would be 8 feet high.
Yes.
But you can put things in there like if you feel an inmate's getting too close to you, and make sure you let the supervisor know.
Yeah.
And so you have these things in the policy. If an inmate comes into custody and you know who this inmate is, I want you to write a memo through your chain of command.
Yeah, let them know.
And you're not getting in trouble because you would get a memo like that, and as a sergeant, I'd call you in my office and say, my first question is, are you going to have an issue supervising this individual?
Sure.
And a lot of times the officer will say, no, I didn't really know him that well. We just went to high school together. And it's like, okay. And a lot of sheriff's departments across this country are in rural communities, and,
sure.
and you're going to know a lot of these people. Or I'd ask him a question. Are you going to have an issue supervising this person? And the answer is like, well, I do. He used to date my sister. He has intimate details about me.
Yeah.
And then you move the officer, right?
Right.
Let the officer work a different housing, put him somewhere else to work for a little while. And if you're worried about staff playing you, when the guy comes and he gets out of custody, then put him right back in his assignment.
Right.
But if that officer is telling you that I don't feel comfortable working and supervising this inmate, then as an administrator, you have to take action. Because if you don't, then you're kind of being deliberately indifferent to a security concern that officer brought to your attention.
Right.
And on the flip side of that, same thing, I always thought there were 3 places you should never force a staff member to work. 1, intake.
Right.
You want to put the proper officer in intake, and you also want that person to want to work there.
Right.
Number 2, mental health. You want the right people working in your mental health unit. And number 3, administrative segregation. And I always had a philosophy myself. If an inmate, if an officer came to me and said, "Hey, Captain Stewart, my fuse is getting too short. I'm getting burnout working in intake.
Yeah.
Can I go work here for a little while?" If an officer ever comes to you as a commander and says, "I'm getting burnt out working in those areas,"
yeah,
by God, you got to move them.
Sure.
Because they're kind of putting you on notice, right?
Absolutely.
And they're doing the right thing. They're bringing it to your
Yes.
attention. My fuse is getting very short. I'm really quick to go to my hard skills.
Yes.
I need to work somewhere else for a little while.
Yeah. Yeah.
Then you do it. And I'm not saying, and don't think of COs, those are coveted jobs.
Right.
In all reality, you go to AdSeg, you're working with another officer usually because everybody up there are cuffed too, so that has to be 2 The mental health, you're there, you're with medical staff, and it takes a special officer to be able to work mental health. That was one area that I tried to avoid. I didn't have as far as I'm concerned, as an officer, I didn't have the capacity.
Sure.
And the proper mindset to work in that unit, and it takes a special officer. And intake, it takes an officer who's great with those verbal skills. I'll give you an example. Inmate comes in, he's all angry because of the way the arresting officer treated him. My favorite thing to do was get him away from the officer, bring him back here and say, all right, Inmate Jones, you have a clean slate with me.
Yeah.
I don't know what that officer did, and I don't care. That's between you and him.
Mm-hmm.
But the way I'm going to treat you from this moment forward is the way you treat me.
Yeah.
All that, you got a clean slate right now. And you take 9 times out of 10 that works. The inmate calms down. You're right, that guy.
Right. Yeah.
So when an officer comes to you and says they're burnt out in this area, assign them somewhere else for a little while. And then back to full circle, back to, an officer who tells you that they have some concern supervising an inmate, you can move the inmate to another housing unit or whatever's easier for your organization,
right,
or reassign the officer for a little while until the inmate gets out of custody. So as administrators, when those things come to you, you have to act on them.
Right.
And you have to take action to solve those problems. So that policy is there. You have these things in policy to protect your officers. Then obviously you got to train them, right?
Yes.
And I think if you don't already, there should be a decent amount of time spent on training your officers about manipulative inmates and
right,
the things that they're going to do. And like I said before, dress for success. The reason I want you to not look like chewed up bubble gum when you come to work, or right, when you turn that corner, somebody hits you with a wrinkle bomb.
Right.
The reason I want you to look sharp, 1, you're representing the department to the community. Mm-hmm. Number 2, I don't want an inmate to look at you and think that they can get to you.
Yeah. Right.
And that's the main thing. So you have that training, you're dealing with that. I am a firm believer in rotating site assignments frequently.
Yeah.
And I would say what's frequent to me is probably every 3 months, but I wouldn't go beyond 6.
I got you.
And I'm not saying some dramatic trend, but if I'm working, let's say housing unit, whatever you call it, 3 Delta, 3 months to 6 months, you're not going to work housing unit 3 Delta. You're going to spend your next rotation in another housing unit somewhere else.
Right.
Because the longer you leave that officer in there, that Stockholm syndrome starts to take over.
Yes.
And a lot of times they start to think, when I hear an officer say, my inmate or my inmates, that's usually a key.
Yeah.
You're going to have issues in that housing unit because this officer is starting to get into that Stockholm syndrome type of mentality.
Yes.
And you have to act when you see that stuff.
Yeah.
So be proactive and rotate them a little more often than you might be doing now. And I don't care if an officer says, but I like working in here.
Right.
You're going to rotate, and I'm doing it for your own safety.
Yes. Yes. I know when the shift I started on, night shift, the sergeant at the time, he was a firm believer. We ran, podular setup and tower with the housing units around it. And he had, he'd have one officer that he liked to keep in each of those pods, be familiar with it, be in control of it, and he'd rotate everybody else. So about for a year and a half nearly, I spent in that same pod. And I'll tell you, from that side of things, it got to the point where I was so sick of them and they were so sick of me, and I knew them so well and they knew me so well. It was almost just, I guess it was like a bad family reunion. You come in to take shift, they'd see you walking through the door, oh, good grief. And I'm looking at them, oh, good grief. But you become familiar with them, whether intentionally or not, it just happens. I mean, I'm spending 12 hours at a time, 7 days every pay period in here with these people. There's going to be that familiarity, whereas you rotate out, I reset,
right?
And I'm able to pay attention to what's going on rather than, oh, that's just so and so.
You just struck something with you that brought up a memory. So let's talk about respect versus dignity.
Yeah.
I remember going to the academy in the early 90s, and I'm going through, and all my instructors would tell me, you have to respect the inmates. treat the inmate with respect the inmates. And then the next class was, let's say, inmate supervision. And the instructor comes in and goes, you have to earn the inmate's respect. You have to earn it. You have to, and words have meaning to me. I pay attention to words, right? Yeah. And if you look up the definition of respect, it means to hold somebody in reverence.
Right. Yes.
So I remember sitting there going, okay, and if you really think about this, and words have meanings, it might be subconsciously, I always thought, am I setting my officers up to fail? Because I'm telling them right off the bat they have to respect the inmates and treat the inmates with respect, but then the officer has to go earn respect. How do you earn respect? By bringing contraband in? Because let's face it, a lot of our officers are younger. And think back to yourself when you were 18 to, let's say, I'll give you 26. You cared what people thought about you.
Yeah.
As you get older, that kind of goes away a little bit more. Unless it's somebody,
close to you, yes.
But when you're younger, you want to be liked.
Sure.
And being a corrections officer is a difficult job to have if you want to be liked.
If you want to be liked, yes.
And then you go back to you have to earn the inmates' respect, but automatically you have to respect them. Mm-hmm. So I got away from using the word respect, and I get why people do it. I get the meaning of it. But I think the real word to use is dignity.
Right.
If you, I don't have a dictionary in front of me, you go look up the word respect and look up the word dignity and compare the two definitions, and you'll see that I'm right. You have to treat individuals with dignity.
Yeah. I mean, they're human beings, so therefore they deserve dignity.
Yes, you don't have to respect everything that somebody does, or you don't have to automatically respect, or you don't have to respect me, I don't have to respect you, but I have to treat you with dignity.
Right. Yeah.
And I think dignity is the right term to use a lot of times. So you must treat the inmates with dignity. And I go back to the word sympathy and empathy.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I don't sympathize with an inmate, but I can be empathetical with the situation.
Sure.
So, again, words have meaning. You have to have quality training. You got to train your staff, but then just be careful how you're training them. And look at subliminal messages you may be sending by the way you're training these guys.
Yes. And when you talk about training specifically, that say you're going to put together an academy. We're going to have a basic academy for our officers. And you look at what curriculum, what do I need to have in this training that's going to equip them to be effective at their job. And I mean, you could write a list 3 miles long of things they need to know. Some of that obviously they don't need to know right off the bat. Some of it's going to be learned by experience. But I think that just in my experience, there's very little in most academies that I've been aware of. Now, obviously not speaking across the board because I don't know. But the practical side of what we've been talking about with, that don't bring in contraband, or don't let an inmate play you, or like you said, treat the inmate with respect and earn their respect. That they're so vague, they're so open-ended that for that officer that doesn't know, okay, I'm supposed to earn their respect, or I'm not supposed to let them play me. Well, what does that look like? Or I'm not supposed to bring them in contraband. Well, I'm not bringing in contraband, but I did a shakedown, I did a search, and I found this. I didn't bring it to them. So, I mean, but if I leave it, I've just earned their respect. Yeah. Get specific with it.
What I used to like to tell my officers was, you have a decision to make, whatever that is. If you pause for a second and you ask yourself this question: if I do this, what I'm about to do, and it was shown on the 9 o'clock news, would my family be proud of me?
Yeah.
So if you pause and think, if the answer is yes,
hey.
If the answer is no, don't do it.
Right.
And you just realize, and always approach what's happening with a skeptical eye.
Right.
Ask yourself, if I do this, and it got plastered all over the news,
right,
would my family be proud of me?
Right.
The answer is no. Obviously, you're not going to do that.
Right.
Right. And if you look at everything that way, because I get it, man. A lot of times, I'm sitting here talking to you guys about this kind of stuff, but some of these things, it took me years to learn.
Sure.
You know,
Right.
and you gain this knowledge through experiences, good
Right.
and bad,
Right.
and that's how and you can sit there and tell an officer these things. I always told them, warm fuzzy. If you're about to do something, and again, you've already thought about, but you don't have that warm fuzzy feeling in your abdomen, you probably shouldn't do it.
Right.
Because that's your subconscious trying to warn you that this could be bad. Or another analogy to use, when your spidey senses are tingling, right?
Yeah.
When your spidey senses are tingling, you might want to pause and think about something.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you could walk up to anybody who worked for me and say one thing to them, and they'd know it came from me: unintended consequences. What are the unintended consequences of me taking this action?
Sure.
And
Yes.
and if those unintended consequences aren't going to be good,
Right. There's my answer.
there's your answer. Don't do it. All what I just said, in a nutshell, pay attention to your common sense.
Yeah.
90% of what we do in corrections is common sense.
Yes.
If a lot of officers would just follow their common sense and think about the 9 o'clock news, would my family be proud of me?
Right.
My policy would only need to be like 5 pages.
Right. Yes. Yes.
We write policy to augment common sense or to try and give somebody common sense a
Yes.
lot of times.
Yes.
Procedure, different story. You know, this is
Right.
how I want you to do things.
Right.
But pay attention to common sense. And if you're facing a situation, you're dealing with an inmate, you don't know what to do in the moment, but it requires action, but you don't know what policy says, I can give you the magic bullet. Make your decision based on safety and security.
Yeah.
As long as you decide something with safety and security foremost in your thought process, even if you were wrong,
Yeah.
you'll be okay.
Right. Because you can defend it.
Because you can defend it and you can articulate why you made that decision, and for lack of a better term, why there was a legitimate governmental interest
Yep.
to make the decision you made. Safety and security.
Yes. Yes. All right, guys. Well, we have made it to the end of another episode. Hope again that got some good stuff out of this Surviving the Mental Chess Game series. Tickled to have Sean on board with us for these. Again, questions, comments, shoot me an email. Got something you want to pass on to Sean, let me know and I will do it. That email address is theshakedown@jailtraining.org. As always, guys, I hope that you enjoyed this, and stay safe, stay sharp, stay vigilant, and we'll see y'all next time. Godspeed.